Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. To the topic of the day. And the topic of the day in this case is the 2022 NBA Draft. We all knew it was coming tonight. We all knew what was going on. And I have so many thoughts that I'm just going to dive into them. But what I would say big picture is this. If you came here for Hot Take Torres expecting to yell and scream and this team screwed up and this team made a mistake and this team was terrible, I really can't do that. I actually really like what most of these teams did, and specifically the top 6 picks. I think those teams made about as good of a decision as they possibly could. Number 7 is fascinating with Shaedon Sharpe. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, I'll hit on some of the big hits and misses from the rest of the first round. So let's get into it. Let's start at number 1 overall. And how about this? I'll tell you this. Your boy Torres gets an awful lot of stuff wrong. We do it at the end of every show where Aaron was right, where Aaron was wrong. But I'll tell you this. The night of the NBA Draft Lottery, what did I say on this show? I said that I believed the Orlando Magic should take Paolo Banchero number 1 overall. Of course, everybody else said they're going to take Jabari Smith. Straight through the NBA draft process, everybody seemingly believed it was going to be Jabari Smith. And then about 24 hours before the NBA draft, all of the odds markets and betting markets seemed to indicate that Paolo Banchero was getting leverage and moving up draft boards and could potentially go number 1 overall. Adrian Wojnarowski seemingly puts out a fake report, probably to just try to help the Orlando Magic keep leverage with the pick. But in the end, after all that Jabari Smith talk, Paolo ends up going number 1 overall. And what I would say to that is pretty straightforward. I mean, look, I said it on lottery night. I said I thought he should be the pick. So selfishly, and you know, I joke about taking credit for it. But the bottom line is I can't sit here and say that I knew they were going to take Paolo Banchero number 1 overall. But I thought they should. And now that they had, let's talk about it. Because to me, this was always the right pick specifically for the Orlando Magic. And what it really comes down to is what I talked about the night of the NBA Draft Lottery. The Orlando Magic are in a very precarious spot, and because they got the pick, it's a different deal than if Oklahoma City or Houston, teams that are rebuilding, get the pick, or on the opposite side, teams that are on the verge of the playoffs, like, say, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the San Antonio Spurs, if they had gotten the pick. Why I thought Paolo always made sense for Orlando was this. Orlando is not in rebuild mode. Orlando is an organization that has not had any real long-term success for a very long time. I talked about it the night of the NBA Draft Lottery, but these stats will blow your mind. Orlando has not won a playoff series since 2010. They have won a grand total of 2 playoff games. Not 2 playoff series. They have won 2 playoff games since 2010. That is 12 years. So the Boston Celtics lost the NBA Finals, but won as many playoff games in the NBA Finals as Orlando has won it since 2010. And so I said all along, if you're Orlando, I don't believe that you can take, with the number 1 overall pick, a long-term upside guy. I think that completely eliminates Chet Holmgren, who we know will not be ready to play next year. I also didn't love the idea of Jabari Smith because Jabari has the tools. I like Jabari Smith. I like what he's about, and I like what he can be, but I also think he needs to work on his game. I don't think he can really create his own shot. We'll talk a little bit more about Jabari when we get to the Houston Rockets pick, but I bring it up because to me, Paolo always made sense because Paolo was the best of both worlds. He is a guy that I believe in this draft, at least of those top 3, is the most ready to step into the NBA right now and help you right away. And if you're the Orlando Magic, you need help right away. You can't sell your fan base. You can't sell whatever season ticket holders you have left on this idea of, well, you know, we got the guy we want. Give us 2 or 3 years. He could be really good in 2025. Nobody wants to hear that. They want a guy to come in now. They want a guy to help now, hopefully get back into the playoffs and maybe win a couple games once you get there. I believe that Paolo is that guy and will be that guy, and that was why he always made sense. Look, we watched him at Duke. I don't need to get into too much of what he did at Duke, but this was a guy that was fantastic all season long, was a 3-level scorer, was a guy that over the course of his freshman year at Duke, playing in some of the biggest games in college basketball, averaged 17 points, 7 rebounds, 34% from three. And what I loved about Paolo was in his biggest games, he played his best. These aren't empty stats like some other guys. This was a guy that in the season opener, Madison Square Garden against Kentucky, drops 22 points. Gonzaga, a game that I was at, 21 points against Chet Holmgren. He actually had bad cramps in that game. Easily probably could have gone for 30 if he played the entire game. NCAA tournament, big games, big moments, 20 points against UNC in the Final Four, 22 points against a veteran Texas Tech team in the Sweet 16. This guy is just the truth. And so credit to the Orlando Magic. I believe this was the right guy at the right moment, the right pick. Paolo at number 1, I had no problem with. What I will say going forward is generally this. I don't really, when I do these kind of NBA draft recap shows, I don't go like pick by pick and this is an A and this is a C and this is a B+. But I do think the first 7 picks in this draft were absolutely fascinating. So let's get into them one by one. I promise we're not going to do it for all 30 first-round picks. But number 2, and we'll just rip through some of these. I love Paolo at number 1 because I thought he was the guy that they needed at this exact moment in Orlando. I like Chet at number 2. And there's not a lot to break down. We've talked about Chet probably going to OKC from the beginning. But OKC, very much in the beginning to middle stages of a rebuild. They are slowly starting to build this thing up. Young players, draft picks. Josh Giddey last year was a surprise lottery pick who played really well. They have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And this is a team and an organization that drafts well, that develops well, and they are kind of on the same time frame as Chet Holmgren. They're not trying to win next year. Well, good thing is Chet Holmgren's not going to be ready next year. They're not even necessarily trying to win the year after as they continue to accumulate picks, continue to build this organization back up. And so all of a sudden you start talking about Chet Holmgren year 2, year 3, year 4, being a guy that's ready to go. That kind of fits perfectly with Oklahoma City. I really like this pick for Oklahoma City. I think it makes sense. I don't know that Chet Holmgren, if you're making futures bets on like rookie of the year, I don't know that Chet Holmgren is your guy, but really like Chet Holmgren at number 2. I'll say this. I thought Houston at number 3 had the easiest pick in the draft. Houston was actually in a perfect spot. 1, like Oklahoma City, they are in very much the beginning stages of a rebuild. Why it works out well for them is because we all deemed that this was a 3-player draft, and so Houston was almost in the perfect position. 3 players, you have the 3rd pick. You don't really have a tough decision to make. You're not drafting on need. You're not drafting on, positional whatever. You're trying to draft the best available player. There are 3 players, and so you can't really screw up the pick. Orlando might screw up the pick. Oklahoma might screw up the pick. Somebody might look up 2, 5, 10 years from now and say, man, Oklahoma City should have taken Jabari Smith over Chet Holmgren. Well, that wasn't really your decision. You were at number 3. You got to take whoever fell to you. Jabari Smith, I think, will be really good. And I know over the last couple weeks, I've talked a lot about Jabari Smith. Should he go number 1? Should he not? And I do have my questions about him. I understand he's a 45, 46% three-point shooter at 6'10". We had Bruce Pearl on this show a week ago to talk about what Jabari Smith does well and doesn't do well. At the same time, while I can question if he should have gone number 1 overall, I can also say at number 3 in a major rebuild, this couldn't have gone much better for Houston. You get the guy that some people were saying was going to be number 1 overall. You have time. You can develop him at his pace, at your pace, and you might end up with the best player of the draft. So shout out to Houston. Don't think there's much to say here because, again, they were always going to take the 3rd guy out of 3. It wasn't the guy that we thought, but it's hard to criticize them because they got the guy that at the end of the day really was basically the best player available. Can't really criticize him there. Let's go to number 4. And again, I swear, I'm not going pick by pick, but I think it was really interesting to me. I think all 6 of the first 6 picks, they just worked out so well for the 6 teams that were picking. So number 1 is Paolo Banchero to Orlando. Number 2 is Chet Holmgren to OKC. Number 3 is Jabari Smith to Houston. Number 4 was where it got interesting because we've talked a little bit about the Sacramento Kings over the last couple weeks. I have a lot of good media friends up in Sacramento, and they, to me, were really the inflection point of this draft, and let me explain why. They are a team, I talk about Orlando having no playoff success. Sacramento hasn't even been to the playoffs since 2006, and my understanding of what's going on in Sacramento is that this offseason, everybody in that building was given an edict. You guys got to make the playoffs next year. And so it's an interesting deal. Again, different from Orlando, different from Houston, different from OKC. And why the Kings were so fascinating was because they could go in a million different directions. They could trade the pick for veteran help. They could go with the best player available, which I think we all thought was going to be Jaden Ivey if that was the case. Or they could go with a guy that actually fits a need because, again, you have to win next year. You don't have time to develop a long-term player. You maybe don't even have the opportunity to take the best player available in Jaden Ivey because he kind of is redundant with your best player in De'Aaron Fox. And so Sacramento, I thought, actually smartly, and I know it's easy to criticize the Sacramento Kings. I know they've been a mess forever, but I thought they smartly drafted Keegan Murray from Iowa. He was a kid who really developed this past season, had an incredible year, leading Iowa to a Big Ten title. And what I like about him is a few different things. First of all, just a really, really talented player that got so much better over the course of his freshman to sophomore year. He is a little bit older, and that does matter, and that is important. But what I like about Keegan Murray is that he was a guy, it was just so fascinating to watch him develop over the course of his 2 years at Iowa. Because his first year, you go back to when his first year at Iowa, averaged 7 points, 5 rebounds per game, and really was a role player alongside the National Player of the Year, Luka Garza. Remember him, two-time follower of the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. And then this year, he developed into an absolute star. 24 points per game, 9 rebounds per game, 40% three-point shooting. And so this is why I like this pick for Sacramento. And I swear, I'm not usually this nice where I like everybody's picks. But they have a specific need. Like I said, their two best players, De'Aaron Fox at point guard and Domantas Sabonis, if you may remember him, he played at Gonzaga. He is a center. The one thing they needed was kind of a four-man who could stretch the floor, who could hit some threes, who would defend, who would play a role. And that's why I like this pick. You could have gotten Jaden Ivey and we would have all patted you on the back and said you got the best player available. But instead, they get a guy that they can plug in right away. And what I really like about Keegan Murray is that he is a guy that throughout his career has played a role. He was a role player in year one, which means that he will be comfortable being a role player in year one in Sacramento next year. I should say he was a role player in year one at Iowa and will be comfortable being a role player in Sacramento next year. So that's why I like this pick, because he fills a need that you have next year in a win or everybody gets fired situation. And over time, he could become a star because we saw him do it at Iowa. Number 5, I'll just say this. I love this pick too. Jaden Ivey to Detroit. And remember, Detroit's got a really nice young core. We actually talked about them a little bit on this show last week in the biggest questions. And I said, I think with the right pick, Detroit could kind of be like the Memphis Grizzlies, right? The Memphis Grizzlies go from the play-in game 2 years ago, the play-in game last year, to boom, they take off and they're the 2 seed in the West this year. And it's because they drafted 3, 4, 5 guys. And they didn't just hit on John Morant and Jaren Jackson at the top of the draft. They hit on Brandon Clark in the middle of the draft. They hit on Desmond Bane in the middle of the draft, late first round, early second round. And that is what Detroit has done over the last 3, 4 years. One, took the right guy in Cade Cunningham last year. By the way, I didn't even mention Cade Cunningham and Paolo Banchero, back-to-back number 1 overall picks. They actually both visited Kentucky on the same weekend, and Kentucky almost got a commitment from both of them. Neither here nor there. We don't have to discuss that. But to go back to Detroit Pistons, you have Cade Cunningham. He is the franchise cornerstone, and at this point, it's just putting talent around him. Well, Sadiq Bey from Villanova 2 years ago, really good wing player. Isaiah Stewart from Washington a few years ago, second-round pick, really good role player, energy, toughness, whatever. Now, you add maybe the best player in this draft and Jaden Ivey to that core, and I am just saying, watch out, Detroit basketball, like they could be back in a hurry. I just think this kid makes so much sense. He's best off the ball. And what I will tell you about Jaden Ivey is what I've said on this podcast a few times now over the last week. I have done a complete 180 on him as a player because I believe that Matt Painter, his head coach, just had no idea how to use him this past year at Purdue. Too focused on feeding the post, too focused on getting it to the big guys, Zach Edey and Travion Williams. When you have a player like Jaden Ivey, just let him go, let him attack, and I think he is going to be great in Detroit. Number 6, another one that I just like. I would be, you guys know me. I would be critical if I thought it warranted it, and we'll get into a couple picks that I didn't like. But number 6, Ben Mathurin from Arizona, I think out of, we said it was a 3-player draft, maybe a 4-player draft with Jaden Ivey. I think we could look up in 10 years and Ben Mathurin is the best player in this draft. And I've told his story a few times, but I remember talking to somebody on the original Arizona coaching staff that recruited him. This was under Sean Miller. It was before I really knew Sean Miller. But I was talking to one of his assistants. And at this time last year, Ben Mathurin could have left for the NBA and been drafted in the second round. And by the way, nobody would have blamed him for leaving after Sean Miller, the coach that recruited him, got fired. But I talked to one of the assistant coaches. They said, no. He knows he's not ready. He wants to come back. He wants to get better. He wants to be a star. Well, what happened this year? He came back and was an absolute star for the Arizona Wildcats this past season. You look at what he did. He went from 10 points per game to 17 per game. Had some of his biggest games against some of the best opponents. Tennessee early in the season on the road. Illinois early in the season on the road. Shot 37% from 3 and went from a really good player to a superstar. And I think he brings that confidence and I think he brings that swag, that dog in him to Indiana. And I think he's just a kid that I believe can have success right away and can have long-term upside. 2 other things that I like about him. 1, he's actually really young. So he just turned 19 years old. Like as an example, Chet Holmgren, who just finished his freshman year, is older than him. Ty Washington, who just finished his freshman year, is more than a year older than him. And Ben Mathurin just finished his sophomore season. So he's really young. And Indiana, for the first time in a long time, is in true rebuild mode. He's going to get lots of minutes. He's going to play right away. I think he has a chance to be really good. I'll tell you this, at some point maybe we'll look at Rookie of the Year odds, but I think that he has a chance to be really special and be special right away for Indiana. Finally, we'll get to number 7, then we'll get to some of the other picks that I liked and some of the ones that I didn't. Number 7 was Shaedon Sharpe. And so if I'm going to take credit for where Aaron was right, Paolo Banchero, then I got to take credit for where Aaron was wrong. And I really did think, and we talked about it on a Wednesday show, after the interviews that Shaedon Sharpe did over the last couple weeks, where he admitted that he decided himself not to play at Kentucky, where he didn't really have answers as to why he didn't play or whatever, I really did think Shaedon Sharpe could fall in this draft. And I will tell you, I spoke to at least one NBA person who said, I wouldn't touch him. I'm freaking out. I don't know what this is all about and why the information is all of a sudden changing. But apparently it didn't matter to the Portland Trail Blazers, who took Shaedon Sharpe at number 7. Listen, I have no massive hot take. Like I said, I wouldn't have blamed anybody for not drafting him, but I'm also not going to blame the Portland Trail Blazers for drafting him. 1, if you're that young, if you're that inexperienced, it's a pretty good spot to go to, right? Damian Lillard is a veteran. Damian Lillard is a worker. Damian Lillard is going to take you under his wing and teach you how to be a professional. You could do a lot worse if you're Shaedon Sharpe, and from the Trailblazers' perspective, you could do a lot worse than taking a kid that would potentially have been the number 1 overall pick next year. And that was why I never really felt like Shaedon Sharpe was going to fall that far. I thought he might fall to 10, 11, somewhere in there. I never thought he was going to fall too far because at the end of the day, you're drafting a kid that could have potentially been the number 1 pick next year, but instead you're drafting him a year ahead of schedule. 3-level scorer, crazy athleticism. No, he doesn't have a lot of game experience. Yes, his motor has been in question. And yes, I wouldn't have blamed teams for passing on him. I don't know that I would have taken him at number 7, but it's hard for me to blame the Portland Trail Blazers for making that same decision. Really quickly, let's rip through some of the other picks in the first round that I really liked and a few that I really didn't. There really, again, weren't very many that I didn't like. 1, Oklahoma City. I just love what Oklahoma City's doing and what they're all about. So Oklahoma City, in the first round, in addition to taking Chet Holmgren, they took the kid Jalen Williams, really fast-rising prospect from Santa Clara, super athletic, long wing. It reminds me of like a Kevin Porter Jr. kind of player, super athletic, is kind of a lead guard at 6'5", 6'6", and he's another one. I'm not sitting here saying that I know I've said there's 9 guys that I think could be the best player in this draft. I don't think he's going to be the best player in this draft, but could you look up and as a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander body type at 6'5", 6'6", could he be averaging 21, 7, and 7 in 2 years? Maybe not 2 years, but 3, 4, 5 years? I think so. And again, he's another player. He played in the WCC at Santa Clara. It's going to be a step up. He's going to OKC. He is on their timeline, much like Chet Holmgren. You don't need him to be great right away. You don't need him to play this second. Instead, you let him develop, maybe spend some time in the G League, maybe spend some time getting NBA reps. I really do like his draft spot at number 20, in the middle of the first round. And finally, let me say this on Oklahoma City. The kid Peyton Watson they got with the 30th pick, that kid has a chance to be really special. Now, for people who don't remember Peyton Watson, he played at UCLA this year. This pick was from Phoenix originally. And what I would say about Peyton Watson, 5-star recruit, he's one of those guys, I think his development got a little bit hurt because of COVID. From California, his senior year was basically ruined, barely played, gets to UCLA veteran team, and he's one. Like, if he goes to a Kentucky or if he goes to somewhere where he would have had a clearer path to playing time, I think he really could have developed. I think he really would have had a chance to really break out as a freshman. But he's at UCLA. They have Johnny Juzang. They have a bunch of veterans. There really is no reason to play him. He gets lost in the shuffle, but he's a guy. He works really hard. He plays hard. He defends. He has the skill set. He hasn't yet figured out the jump shot, but the jump shot is something that can be taught. So you can learn a jump shot once you get to the NBA. You can't learn what he naturally has. 6'8", super athletic, can jump out of the gym, plays really hard. I just love what Oklahoma City did specifically in the first round with those 3 picks because, again, they identified guys that fit their timeline. They are a great developmental organization. They are not trying to make the playoffs next year. And if 2-3 of these guys can hit, all of a sudden you're talking about a super dynamic young core going forward over the next few years. A couple other picks I like. I mentioned Jaden Ivey earlier with Detroit. And I love the fact that they got Jalen Duren later in the round. He was picked by Charlotte, traded to Detroit, along with Kemba Walker. And why I like the Jalen Duren pick is pretty straightforward. Listen, there's this notion, I think we've talked about on this show. There's this notion like, oh, you can't take a big guy early in the draft anymore, especially big guys that can't shoot. I think that is a load of you-know-what. Now, look, in a perfect world, do you want to have 5 shooters on the floor at all times? Of course. Even the Golden State Warriors don't have 5 shooters on the floor at all times. Gary Payton Jr. is not a shooter. Kevon Looney's not a shooter. Draymond Green doesn't appear to be a shooter anymore. So this notion that you have to have guys that can all shoot, I don't buy it. And I still believe that in the NBA right now at this second, size, forgive me for saying this, but size still does matter, right? Like there's this notion that centers are going to be obsolete like the Tyrannosaurus Rex in 3 years. Like that nobody's going to play a center. Well, I watched the NBA playoffs. Bam Adebayo's a big guy who played big minutes, defends the rim, rebounds, protects the basket. You still need those guys. DeAndre Ayton is going to get a ton of money this year because he has all of those skills. Giannis is an MVP, and I'm not saying Jalen Duren's going to be Giannis, but Giannis is an MVP who mostly still plays within 15 feet from the basket. The three-point shot still isn't totally there. Kevon Looney got reps in the NBA Finals. Robert Williams got reps in the NBA Finals. So the idea that you can't have big guys that can't shoot, I just think is ridiculous. I love what Detroit did with Jaden Ivey and with this kid Jalen Duren from the Memphis Tigers in the first round. Let's keep it going. Other picks that I liked. I'll say this, really like what the Spurs did. 2 guys that I think are going to develop really nicely in that organization. Jeremy Sohan from Baylor, super athletic wing, really tough. Another guy that the shot isn't there yet, the scoring isn't there yet, but he defends his butt off. Great developmental organization. I love what the Spurs did with that pick. And I love what they did with their second pick, too, Malachi Branham from Ohio State. He was a guy that was maybe a little bit underrated coming into college. Didn't know a lot about him. I think he was about a top 30 prospect. And then you turn on these games, you sit there and say, who is that dude? 6'6", super athletic, great mid-range jumper, great three-point jumper. Didn't really have a huge season because Ohio State didn't really have incredible moments. He's playing alongside E.J. Liddell, another guy that was projected to go very high in this draft. E.J. Liddell's the veteran. He's the older player. And so Malachi Branham kind of was just off everybody's radar. Then late in the year, he completely blows up. And I think he has a chance to be really, really good in the NBA. Really like that pick from San Antonio. Really like the Atlanta Hawks adding A.J. Griffin. We talked about A.J. Griffin. Did think the spot that he went to mattered. I've talked about, is he just a three-point shooter? Is he a three-level scorer? We only saw the three-point shooting at Duke. But Atlanta has a guy named Trae Young who's going to do most of the creating, most of the dishing, And the one thing they need is guys that can step out and hit threes. A.J. Griffin can do that. Let's keep going with the picks that I like. Christian Braun with the Denver Nuggets. I love Christian Braun is the white kid from Kansas, super athletic, jumps out of the gym. I'm just going to say it. I don't think he gets enough credit for the athlete that he is because he's a white dude, but jumps out of the gym, defends his butt off, and I think you put him alongside Jamal Murray. You say, Jamal Murray, you go get your buckets. This guy's going to defend the other team's best player. This kid's going to run the floor. He's going to shoot threes. Christian Braun with that team, with Nikola Jokic, the reigning MVP, has a chance to be really good. And the last one, I couldn't go without saying it. I got to say it. My boy Dalen Terry, Chicago Bulls, I told you the second he entered the NBA draft, I said this guy is going to rise up draft boards and he is going to be a guy that people fall in love with when he goes through the draft process. And that's exactly what happened. Was a kid that this year at Arizona was mostly a role player, but 6'7", defended, created for others. And then late in the season, when his number was called, when Kirk Kriisa got injured, and Arizona needed a star, this kid stepped up and was great in their final few games of the season. We've talked about it a ton, but it is worth noting again that when you look at his game log, again, there weren't a ton of big games early in the season. Then you go late, he was like basically their best player. He was a guy who had 17, 7, and 7 against UCLA in the Pac-12 championship game. 17, 6, and 3 with 2 3-pointers made against Houston in the Sweet 16. I love Dalen Terry. Couple picks that I'm kind of lukewarm on. By the way, I do like Ty Washington late in the first round. I think if Ty Washington is healthy, we're talking about a top 15 pick at worst. Unfortunately, it just did not happen for him. And I'll say this, too, one last thing. I'll give credit to a kid named Marjan Beauchamp, number 24 overall. He was a kid that during COVID, he got caught up in all this whatever, decides to go the pro route out of high school, goes to some weird academy and trains for a year. Nobody hears from him. Doesn't go as planned, has to go to a JUCO, ends up with the G League Ignite program this year, and really refines his game and develops his game. I'm happy to see it. Took about a year or two longer than expected, but credit to him, played himself into the first round. Milwaukee Bucks is a perfect situation. I'll say this, in terms of picks that I didn't like, especially in the first round, there's really only one that comes to mind. Listen, I'll say this. I do think Ochai Agbaji was probably picked a little bit ahead of schedule at 14 overall. He's an older player. I don't know how much better he can get, but he's going to the Cleveland Cavaliers. They're a playoff team already, or on the cusp of a playoff spot. They have Evan Mobley. They have good young players. They just need him to play a role, so I don't hate that pick. I just think he was probably a little drafted ahead of schedule. Other than that, the only pick that I really have any kind of question about, David Roddy, number 23 to the Philadelphia 76ers. Not criticizing the kid, not saying he can't play, but he's like an undersized power forward, not super athletic. He can step out and hit threes. I didn't really think he was an NBA player when I watched him this year. Obviously, he entered the draft ahead of schedule. He knew that he was going to get picked. Surprised to see him picked number 23 overall by the Philadelphia 76ers.